The heat in Redemption was a physical thing. It wasn't just in the air. It was in the silence between the buzzing of flies, in the brittle wood of the boardwalks, and in the weary slump of every soul unfortunate enough to call the town home. For Marshal Silas Blackwood, it was the weight of years pressing down on him, a constant reminder of the life he'd failed to outrun. He sat in the cool dark of his office, the door shut not against the heat, but against the town itself. The single window, coated in a fine layer of ochre dust, was his only connection to the world he'd sworn to uphold, and now merely endured. For 5 years, Silas had been the ghost of the law in a town ruled by a man named Jedediah Kane. He wore the badge, but it was Kane's shadow that fell long and dark over every transaction, every whispered conversation. Silas's duties had dwindled to a simple, unspoken agreement. He would handle the drunks who got too loud, and he would look the other way on everything else. It was a coward's peace, and every morning the face he saw in his shaving mirror told him so. He ran a hand over his jaw, the gray in his beard seeming to multiply with each sunrise. His office was a testament to this truce. The rifle rack held a single, well-oiled Winchester, but the key to the ammunition locker was lost somewhere in a desk drawer he never opened. The 3 cells in the back were monuments to disuse, their iron bars filmed with rust, the locks seized tight. Redemption didn't have crime. It had Kane. A sound from the street pulled him from his stupor. It wasn't the usual clatter of a wagon or the lazy banter of Kane's ranch hands. It was the sound of a crowd, a low, ugly murmur that pricked at the edges of Silas's conscience. He rose slowly, his joints creaking a protest, and moved to the dusty window. He didn't wipe it clean. The grime was a welcome filter, blurring the edges of a reality he preferred not to see too clearly. In the center of the main street, directly in front of the saloon Kane owned, was a makeshift platform. A crowd had gathered, mostly men from Kane's sprawling cattle empire, their faces hard and sun-scorched. On the platform stood Kane himself, a bear of a man with a booming voice and eyes as small and cold as river stones. He was laughing, a sound that always curdled the air. Beside him stood a smaller, wiry man, an auctioneer of sorts, though his trade was usually in livestock, not people. And next to the auctioneer, small and trembling, was a girl. Silas felt a familiar, sickening lurch in his gut. She couldn't have been more than 18. Her dress was little more than sackcloth, torn and stained. Her hair, a tangle of dark strands, fell over her face, but he could see the dirt streaks on her cheeks, the raw chafe marks on her wrists where ropes had been. She stood with her head bowed, her shoulders hunched as if waiting for a blow. She was a stray, a piece of human driftwood washed up at the edge of Kane's cruel ocean. "What am I bid for this fine specimen?" the auctioneer chirped, his voice tinny and false. "Found wanderin' out near the salt flats. No name, no kin. Strong back, I reckon. Good for laundry, maybe more." He winked at the leering crowd. Silas saw Sarah, the baker's wife, standing at the edge of the crowd, her own young son clinging to her skirts. She clutched the boy tight, her face a mask of horror and disgust. Her husband, a good but timid man, stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the ground, his hands clenched into useless fists. Sarah's eyes, however, darted across the street, finding the dusty window of the marshal's office. She didn't plead or gesture. She just stared, her eyes asking the question the whole town was too afraid to voice. "Are you going to do anything?" Kane let the pathetic bidding go on for a moment. A few of his men threw out paltry offers, laughing as they did. It wasn't about the money. It was about the display. It was a reminder of who held the power in Redemption. Finally, Kane held up a hand, silencing the crude jests. He stepped forward, pulling a single silver dollar from his vest pocket. He flicked it into the air, the coin catching the brutal sunlight in a flash of white. $1. Kane's voice boomed, cutting through the heat. "I'll pay $1 for her. To show that's all a person is worth when they got nothing and nobody." He caught the coin and slapped it into the auctioneer's hand. The transaction was done. Kane's men cheered. He strode over to the girl and grabbed her by the arm. She flinched, but made no sound. A silent, terrifying stillness in her surrender. He started to drag her toward the saloon, his victory lap before the town he owned. Silas turned from the window. The room was suddenly suffocating, the air thick with the dust of his own inaction. He saw his reflection in the dark glass of a framed commendation from a past life, a life where he hadn't been a coward. The man in the reflection was a stranger, gaunt and haunted. He thought of the war, of the things he'd done and seen, the violence he'd packed away like an old uniform. He had come to redemption for silence, for an absence of conflict. He had mistaken it for peace. Sarah's face flashed in his mind, the girl's trembling form, the glint of that single insulting dollar. Something inside him, a rusty gear that hadn't turned in 5 long years, began to grind. It was a slow, painful movement, scraping away the corrosion of his own compromises. He walked over to the rifle rack. He didn't take the Winchester. Instead, he unbuckled his gun belt, the one he wore every day, the one with the Colt Peacemaker that hadn't been fired at another man since he'd arrived. He checked the cylinder. It was fully loaded as always, a habit from a life he pretended to have forgotten. He buckled it back on, cinching it a little tighter than usual. Then, for the first time in 5 years, he opened his office door and stepped out into the sun. The heat hit him like a fist. The murmur of the crowd died as heads turned. The sight of the marshal walking with purpose was so unusual it was like seeing a river run uphill. His steps were measured, each bootfall on the dusty street a deliberate punctuation mark ending a long sentence of apathy. He didn't look at the townsfolk. He didn't look at Sarah. His eyes were fixed on one man. Jedediah Kane had reached the bat-wing doors of the saloon, still dragging the girl. He felt the silence behind him and turned, a smirk on his face that faded into a look of mild annoyance when he saw Silas approaching. Well, Marshal, Kane said, his voice dripping with condescension. Decided to stretch your legs? Don't worry, the fun's over. Just collecting my property. He gave the girl's arm a vicious shake to punctuate the word. Silas stopped about 10 feet away. He ignored the 2 burly ranch hands who had moved to flank Kane, their hands hovering near their own holsters. Silas's posture was relaxed, but his eyes were like chips of flint. Let the girl go, Kane, he said. His voice was rough from disuse, but it carried a weight that surprised even him. Kane chuckled, a low, dangerous rumble. Let her go? I just paid a whole $1 for her, Marshal. That's a binding contract in this town. You know that. You're the law, after all. There's laws, and there's what's right, Silas replied, his gaze unwavering. You're on the wrong side of this one. Am I? Kane's smile was all teeth. Who's going to tell me so? You? Look around, Silas. This is my town. These are my men, and you're just a relic, a ghost with a tin star. One of Kane's men, a lanky youth with a cruel streak, took a step forward. The boss said to back off, Marshal. You're getting a little deaf in your old age. Silas didn't even glance at him. His focus remained entirely on Kane. I'm not going to ask you again. The air grew thick, the silence absolute. The sun beat down, and sweat trickled down Silas's temples. He could feel the eyes of the entire town on him, feel their collective breath held in their lungs. This was it, the moment the coward's peace shattered. Kane's eyes narrowed. He saw something in Silas he hadn't seen in 5 years. A flicker of the man he'd heard stories about when he first rode into the territory. A dangerous man. For a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Kane's face, but it was quickly replaced by arrogance. He couldn't back down now, not in front of everyone. He shoved the girl forward, sending her stumbling to the dirt. She's mine, he spat. You want her, you'll have to come through me, and my friends. He nodded to his men. The sound of 2 holsters being unstrapped was deafening in the quiet. Silas had made his choice. Now he had to live with it, or die from it. But Silas didn't draw. Not yet. His hands remained loose at his sides. He looked down at the girl, who was now crumpled in the dust between them, a pawn in a game she had no say in. He saw a tremor run through her, but her head was still bowed. She hadn't made a sound. Last chance, Jedediah, Silas said, his voice low. Walk away. Kane laughed. It was a sharp, ugly sound. The old dog still thinks he can bark. He gave the signal. Teach him some respect, boys. The world exploded into motion. The 2 ranch hands went for their guns, but they were saloon brawlers, not gunfighters. Their movements were clumsy, eager. Silas's were not. The 5 years of rust were only on his soul, not his body. His hand moved in a blur, a single economical motion that was both drawing and firing. The Colt bucked in his hand once, the sound a flat, hard crack that echoed off the storefronts. The lanky youth on Kane's right grunted, his gun clattering to the dirt as he stared in disbelief at the hole in his hand. Before the second man could even clear his leather, Silas had taken 2 long strides forward, not toward the man, but toward Kane. He moved with a speed that defied his age, sidestepping the second gunman and bringing the heavy steel barrel of his peacemaker up in a short, brutal arc. It connected with the man's temple with a sickening thud. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed like a sack of grain. The entire exchange took less than 3 seconds. The crowd gasped. Kane stood frozen, his own gun half drawn, his face a comical picture of shock and disbelief. He'd poked a bear he thought was asleep, only to find it was wide awake and very, very angry. Silas now stood directly in front of Kane, the smoking muzzle of his Colt leveled squarely at the bigger man's chest. The lanky youth was on the ground, whimpering and clutching his bleeding hand. The other was unconscious. The rest of Kane's men, who had been laughing moments before, were now statues, their hands held carefully away from their guns. "The thing about relics, Jedediah," Silas said, his voice dangerously calm, "is that they were built to last." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The authority was no longer in the tin star on his chest, but in the cold, hard certainty in his eyes. He flicked his gaze to Kane's half-drawn pistol. "I'd advise you to put that away." Slowly. Kane's face was a storm of fury and humiliation. Being challenged was one thing. Being dismantled so effortlessly in front of the entire town was another. His fingers twitched on the handle of his gun. For a moment his pride warred with his survival instinct. Silas could see the battle in his eyes. "Try it," Silas whispered, almost daring him. "Give me a reason." The whisper was more chilling than any shout. The fight drained out of Kane. His shoulders slumped. With a look of pure venom, he slowly, carefully, slid his pistol back into its holster. "Now," Silas said, his gun never wavering. "Get your men, the one that can walk and the one that can't, and get out of my sight." Kane stared at Silas, his chest heaving. He opened his mouth to say something, a threat, a promise of revenge. But no words came out. He was beaten. Without another word, he turned, helped his whimpering man to his feet, and gestured for his other stunned cronies to drag the unconscious one away. They scrambled to obey, their retreat clumsy and inglorious. The street was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of awe. Silas stood there for a long moment, the adrenaline slowly beginning to fade, leaving a familiar weariness in its place. He lowered his gun, the smell of burnt powder sharp in the hot air. He looked at the townsfolk, who were staring at him as if seeing him for the first time. He saw Sarah, her hand over her mouth, tears of relief in her eyes. His gaze fell to the girl. She was still on the ground, unmoving. He holstered his Colt and walked over, kneeling in the dust beside her. "It's all right, miss," he said softly. "It's over." He reached out a hand to help her up. For the first time, she lifted her head. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, her eyes wide and dark. But as she looked at him, it wasn't just fear he saw. It was something else. A deep, unnerving watchfulness. An intelligence that seemed out of place with her ragged appearance. She took his hand, her grip surprisingly firm, and allowed him to help her to her feet. "What's your name?" Silas asked. She swallowed, her throat dry. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Ilara." "Well, Ilara," Silas said, his voice gentle. "You're not safe out here. Kane's a sore loser. He'll be back, and he'll bring more men. You'll stay with me, in the jailhouse. It's the safest place in town." He was offering her a cell as a sanctuary. It was the only thing he could think of. He led her across the street, the crowd parting before them like the sea. He could feel their stares, their whispered excitement. The marshal was back. Justice had returned to redemption. It felt like a victory, a clean, simple win. He led Ilara into the dark, cool office. She looked around, her eyes taking in the dusty desk, the rifle rack, the 3 rusted cells. He found the key to the main cell block door, the one that hadn't been used in years, and worked it in the stiff lock. With a groan of protesting metal, the door swung open. He chose the cleanest of the 3 cells and ushered her inside. It had a simple cot with a thin mattress. "It's not much," he said apologetically, "but you'll be safe in here. I'll bring you some food and water. Nobody will get to you. I give you my word." She just nodded, her eyes wide, and sat on the edge of the cot, looking small and lost in the gloom. Silas pulled the heavy barred door shut. The sound of the lock clicking into place echoed in the small building. He felt a profound sense of relief. He had done the right thing. He had faced the monster and won. The girl was safe. The town had its marshal back. For the first time in a long time, Silas Blackwood felt a glimmer of the man he used to be. A protector, He stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. He expected to hear her cry, to hear some sound of distress, but there was nothing. Only a profound, unsettling stillness from within the cell. He turned and walked back into his main office, feeling the weight of the day settle on him. He walked to the window and looked out at the street. The crowd was dispersing, but there was a buzz in the air, a lightness that hadn't been there an hour ago. He had stared down Kane and his thugs. He had saved the girl. The immediate danger was over. It was then that he heard it. It started as a vibration, a faint tremor in the floorboards, so subtle he thought it was his own exhaustion. But then it grew, a low, deep thrumming that was more felt than heard. It sounded like distant thunder, but the sky outside was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The townspeople heard it too. He saw them stop their conversations, their heads tilting, their faces confused. Silas's eyes scanned the horizon, searching the shimmering line where the desert met the sky. At first, there was nothing, just the endless expanse of rock and scrub. Then he saw it, a dark speck on the distant western ridge, then another, and another. A lone rider appeared, a silhouette against the blazing sun. He was soon joined by a dozen more, cresting the ridge in a long, silent line. Then more came, and more still, pouring over the horizon like a black tide. They weren't a posse. They weren't cowboys. They were warriors, sitting astride their horses with a discipline and stillness that spoke of something far more organized than a simple revenge party. The thrumming grew into a low, terrifying roar, the sound of hundreds of horses moving as one. The townsfolk were frozen in the street now, their brief celebration forgotten, replaced by a primal, stomach-clenching fear. They weren't just riders, they were an army, and they were heading directly for redemption. Silas stared, his blood running cold. His small victory over Kane felt like a child's game now. He had thought he was ending a problem. But as he watched the horizon disappear behind a line of at least 300 silent, determined riders, he realized he hadn't averted a crisis at all. He had just locked himself, and his entire town, in the very center of the trap. The quiet from the jail cell behind him was no longer the sound of a rescued victim. It was the sound of the bait. The air in his office, once a cool refuge, now felt thin and stale. The distant thunder of hooves was a promise, a death rattle for the fragile peace he had just purchased with 2 bullets and a pistol whip. Silas strode to the back of the office, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He stood before the cell where Alara sat, her posture unchanged. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw past the dirt and the fear. Her eyes were not the eyes of a lost stray. They were ancient, perceptive, and utterly calm. "They're coming for you," Silas said. It wasn't a question. She nodded once, a small, deliberate movement. "They are my people." The words hung in the air, rearranging the entire world. My people, not a posse, not Kane's reinforcements. An army, her army. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low. "I am Alara of the Sand River people," she said, her voice soft but clear, losing the whispery edge it had before. "Daughter of the chieftain. I was on my journey of solitude, a vision quest. Kane's men found me. They thought I was lost." Silas stared at her, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying speed. The quiet dignity, the lack of screaming or begging. She hadn't been broken. She had been waiting, judging. He had locked a princess in his jail cell. He had defended her from a greedy rancher, only to place himself in the path of a warrior nation coming to reclaim her. "Your father, he won't understand," Silas said, the words feeling foolish as he spoke them. "He'll see his daughter in a cell. He'll see this town." He trailed off, the image of fire and slaughter filling his mind. "He will see what is shown to him," Alara said, rising from the cot. She moved to the bars of the cell, her small hands gripping the cold iron. "He is a man of honor, but his love for me is a fire that can burn reason to ash. What he does next depends on you, Marshal. It has depended on you since the moment you stepped out of that door." The weight of her words was heavier than any badge. He had acted to save one life, and in doing so, had gambled with the lives of every man, woman, and child in redemption. The rumbling outside was closer now, a physical presence that shook the glass in the window. The town was a drum, and the approaching hoofbeats were the rhythm of its impending doom. Silas turned, leaving Alara at the bars, and walked back to the front door. He had to meet them. He had to be the one to show them what had happened. He stepped outside, the roar of the hooves washing over him. The army had stopped at the edge of town, a silent, unbreachable wall of men and horses. They kicked up a cloud of dust that hung in the air, turning the brutal afternoon sun into a blood-red haze. In the center of the line, one man dismounted and began to walk forward. He was tall, his hair long and gray, streaked with black. He wore simple leather, but he moved with an authority that needed no ornament. His face was a mask of granite and grief, his eyes burning with a cold fire as they scanned the town, finally landing on the lone figure with the tin star. This had to be her father, the chieftain. From the other end of the street, another sound cut through the tension, the slam of the saloon doors. Jedediah Kane emerged, flanked by a dozen of his most loyal men, the ones who hadn't run. Their faces were grim, their hands on their guns. Kane had seen the approaching army not as a threat, but as an opportunity. "Marshal," Kane's voice boomed, full of false bravado. "Looks like you kicked a hornet's nest. These savages are here to burn us all to the ground. It's your fault, but I'm not going to let my town pay for your mistake." He was playing to the townspeople, who were peering from behind curtains and peeking over windowsills, their faces pale with terror. He was trying to turn their fear into a weapon he could wield. "These people are farmers, shopkeepers," Kane shouted, gesturing to the closed doors. "They need a leader, Silas, someone to protect them. Side with me. We'll run these trespassers out of our valley together. Be the hero they think you are." The chieftain stopped 50 yards away, his hand raised in a sign of parley. He was waiting. The entire world was waiting. Silas looked at Kane, at the desperation and cunning in his eyes. He saw the path Kane was offering, a path of violence and fear, one that would pit the town against the warriors and likely end in a massacre, with Kane picking through the ashes. Then he looked at the chieftain, a father who had come for his child. He thought of Alara, her calm dignity behind the iron bars. There was only one path, the one he had started down when he first walked out of his office. "There's only one trespasser here, Kane," Silas called back, his voice ringing with a clarity that surprised him. "And it's you. You and your greed. This is a parley. Stand down." "Stand down?" Kane laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "They'll kill us all. You're a fool, Blackwood, a suicidal old fool." He turned to his men. "The marshal has lost his nerve. He's siding with them. The town is ours to protect. Let's show these heathens how redemption deals with unwanted guests." Kane's men began to spread out, taking cover behind water troughs and wagons, their rifles glinting in the red sun. But the town did not respond. The windows remained shut. The doors stayed barred. There was no rush of armed citizens joining Kane's cause. There was only silence. Kane's face tightened. "What are you waiting for?" he bellowed at the silent buildings. "Get your rifles! Help us!" The door to the bakery opened. It wasn't the baker, Thomas, who stepped out. It was his wife, Sarah. She held no weapon. Her hands were empty, clasped in front of her. She took a few steps into the street, her face resolute, and looked directly at Kane. "No," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the tense quiet, it carried like a pistol shot. Kane stared at her, flabbergasted. "What did you say, woman?" "I said no," Sarah repeated, her chin held high. "We saw what you did. We saw you try to sell a human being for $1, and we saw the marshal stop you. He did what was right. We stand with him." A ripple of shock went through Kane's men. From across the street, the door to the general store opened. Old man Hemlock, a man so timid he barely spoke above a whisper, stepped out. He nodded at Sarah, then at Silas. Then another door opened, and another. One by one, the people of redemption emerged from their homes. The blacksmith, the carpenter, the stable hand. They were unarmed. They just stood there, a silent testament. Thomas the baker was the last one out. He looked at his wife, standing alone and defiant, and something in his gentle face hardened. He walked to her side and took her hand. His gaze met Silas's, and in it, Silas saw not fear, but a shared resolve. This was their choice. Kane had offered them a war born of fear. Silas had offered them nothing but a sliver of hope, a belief in what was right, and they had chosen. They had chosen him. Kane's face was a mask of purple rage. His plan was crumbling. The townspeople weren't his shield. They were a jury, and they had delivered their verdict. "Fools! You're all fools. They will slaughter you," he screamed, his voice cracking. He gestured wildly at the silent army. "This is on your heads." The chieftain had watched the entire exchange, his expression unreadable. He took another step forward. Silas held up a hand, a gesture to both the chieftain and to Kane. He walked into the middle of the street, placing himself between all three factions: the furious rancher, the terrified but resolute town, and the silent army. "My name is Marshal Silas Blackwood," he called out to the chieftain, his voice steady. "Your daughter is safe. She is unharmed. She is under my protection." The chieftain's eyes narrowed. "Protection? By locking her in a cage?" "Yes," Silas replied without hesitation, "until I was sure who the real threat was. I am sure now." He turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Cain. "The man who harmed her is Jedediah Cain. He is the one who broke the peace. He is the one who owes a debt." Cain's composure finally snapped. He was cornered, humiliated, and stripped of his power. His eyes were wild. "You want a debt paid?" he shrieked. He raised his pistol, but he didn't aim it at Silas or at the chieftain. He aimed it at the closest, easiest target: Sarah. The world seemed to slow down. Silas saw the gun swing around. He saw the terror flash in Sarah's eyes. He saw Thomas move to shield her. He was too far away. He wouldn't make it in time, but he didn't have to. From the jailhouse, there was a deafening crack, not of a gunshot, but of splintering wood. The door to Silas's office flew open, torn from its hinges. Ilara stood there, her face a storm of fury. In her hand, she held Silas's spare rifle, the big Winchester from the rack. She must have broken the cell lock, then the weapons locker. She moved with a speed and ferocity that was breathtaking. She didn't aim at Cain. Like Silas before her, she moved. She sprinted across the space between the jail and the bakery, a blur of motion. Cain, startled by her appearance, hesitated for a split second. It was all she needed. She didn't fire the rifle. She used it as a spear, a staff, a whirlwind of seasoned wood and steel. She deflected Cain's pistol arm upwards, the shot going harmlessly into the sky. In the same motion, she brought the butt of the rifle around, a powerful, vicious swing that connected with Cain's jaw. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud. Cain's eyes went wide with shock and pain, and he crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even landed. Silence. Absolute, profound silence. The townspeople stared. Cain's remaining men stood frozen, their weapons forgotten. The chieftain and his warriors watched, motionless. Ilara stood over Cain's crumpled form, the rifle held at the ready, her chest heaving. She was no longer a victim. She was a warrior princess, fierce and terrible and beautiful. She looked at Silas, her eyes blazing, and gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, a nod of partnership, of a shared victory. Silas walked over to the unconscious Cain and nudged him with his boot. He was out cold. He looked at Cain's men. Their bravado was gone, replaced by stark fear. "Drop your guns," Silas ordered, his voice like iron. "Your reign is over." One by one the guns thudded into the dust. The fight was done. The chieftain walked forward now, his long strides eating up the distance. He stopped not in front of Silas, but in front of his daughter. He looked from her to the unconscious man on the ground, then to the silent, watching townspeople. He placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder, his granite face softening with a relief so profound it was heartbreaking. "You are well, my daughter," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I am well, father," she replied, her own voice softening. "Because of him." She looked at Silas. "And because of them?" She gestured to the town. The chieftain's gaze fell upon Silas. It was a long, measuring look. He was seeing not just a lawman, but the man his daughter had described. He saw the weariness, the age, but also the core of steel that had refused to bend. "You have protected my daughter," the chieftain said. It was a statement of fact, a declaration. "You have shown honor when you were surrounded by cowards. My people are in your debt." Silas shook his head. "No debt. I was just doing my job. For the first time in a long time." He looked over at Sarah and Thomas, who were holding each other. The immediate danger passed. He looked at the faces of the townspeople, their fear slowly being replaced by a tentative pride. "We were all just doing our jobs." The chieftain nodded slowly. He understood. He looked at Cain on the ground. "What will you do with this one?" "My people have their own justice for those who prey on the lost." The offer hung in the air, a promise of a swift and brutal end for Jedediah Cain. It would have been easy to accept, to let Cain disappear into the desert and never be seen again. But that wasn't the law, not his law. "His justice will be found here," Silas said firmly. "In a cell, and before a judge. It's a slower way, but it's our way." The chieftain studied him for another long moment, then a flicker of a smile touched his lips. "A good way." He turned to his warriors and raised a hand, speaking to them in his own tongue. The tension that had held the valley in its grip for the last hour finally broke. The warriors relaxed their postures, their silent menace receding like the tide. The aftermath was quiet and efficient. Silas, with help from the blacksmith, rounded up Cain's men and locked them in the now empty cells. Cain himself was dragged in and thrown into the one Alara had just vacated, his jaw already beginning to swell grotesquely. He would face the circuit judge, and for the first time, he would face him without the power of the town's fear to protect him. Ilara and her father stayed until dusk. They shared water with Silas and the town elders on the boardwalk in front of the marshal's office. There were no grand speeches, just a quiet understanding that passed between people who had faced a great darkness together and had chosen the light. As the sun dipped below the western ridge, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the Sand River people mounted their horses. Ilara approached Silas one last time. "You gave this town its name back, Marshal Blackwood," she said. "I think the town gave it back to me," he replied, a small, genuine smile on his face. She smiled back, a brilliant, beautiful thing. "Perhaps you are both right." With that, she mounted her horse and rode to join her father. The army of warriors turned and moved away, not as a threat, but as a silent, powerful escort, their hoofbeats a soft whisper fading into the twilight. Silas stood on the street, watching them go. The townspeople were gathered nearby, not in a crowd, but in small groups, talking softly, a sense of community humming between them. Sarah brought him a fresh cup of coffee from the bakery. "It's a new day, Marshal," she said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Yes, Sarah," Silas said, taking the cup. The coffee was hot and strong. "I believe it is." He looked down the main street of Redemption. The dust was settling. The air was cool and clean. The silence was no longer heavy with fear or apathy. It was peace, a real peace, earned not through cowardice, but through courage. His own, and the courage of an entire town that had simply been waiting for someone to show them the way. He was home. He was finally home. And they proved that the courage of one can ignite the strength of many. It's a lesson that echoes through the canyons and across the plains, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, a single spark of justice can light up the entire world. The spirit of the West lives on in tales like these. To hear more stories of unlikely heroes and the communities they inspire, subscribe to our channel and become a guardian of their legacy.